Thank you very much. Thank you to the organizers of this conference. I think it's a great opportunity to bring together all of our knowledge in new technologies for cancer patients and for clinical trials. And as summarized, my title is not Wearables in Targeted Therapies. I would say it's just in early phase clinical trials for cancer, or we can even make it simpler and say it's just in patients with cancer, because I think our results can be extrapolated to any patient. So we extract this data from clinical trials, but I think they can be generalized. These are my disclosures. So the problem in clinical research, I think part of our success is that we are able to make objective measurements of everything we do. And we do that for toxicity criteria with the CTCA. We do that for the RECIST measurements. We do that in survival curves. We dichotomize survival or progression-free against plot, and then we compare things. So we need to make objective measurements to be really scientific. So how we define a general condition, that is very subjective. There are different other specialties or different settings in life that, for example, sports, that someone can say that someone is fit, someone is not fit. That's very subjective. But in sports, they have statistics for everything: the goals, the passes, the meters they run, how they recoverable. So there's really objectivity into this data. But what do we have so far for general condition in oncology? It is very sad that we have first Karnofsky scale. That is dated from 1948. It's a quite complex scale because it's 10 items, and doctors, based on their subjectivity, apply a number to a general condition of the patient. And it took us almost 40 years to improve a little bit just that scale with the ECOG performance scale that is from 1982. So more than 40 years, and nothing has changed. This is the scale we use every day. It's our inclusion and exclusion criteria for clinical trials. So we are depending on this scale to see if a patient is enrolled in a trial or not. And that is still quite, I think, sad so far. So what are these limitations? And the first you can see is subjectivity. That depends on the clinical impression. On 5 minutes interview, what you talk to the patient, do you go out, you talk to the relatives, and with just based on that, you come to a conclusion and you determine the ECOG of the patient, and that leads to bias. And bias, the observer variability, limits this reproducibility and consistency. And that, in the end, has a research impact. This subjectivity affects the inclusion, exclusion criteria and trials, and in the end, the outcomes. So we based our science on subjectivity. So what can we do? By 2017, the wearables were already a reality. Like most of the steps in science, they start with a technology advance. And already by that time, 1 in 5 Americans had wearable devices, and even 10% of them wore them every day. So there was growing prevalence, they were getting cheaper, smartphones were more used. So in 2018, this paper came out, and the title says it all. It's Wearable Activity Monitors to Assess PS and Predict Clinical Outcomes in Advanced Cancer Patients. That summarizes everything we're going to talk about, and this is from 6 years ago. Basically, what they did is they gave a wristband, a Fitbit band, to 37 patients with advanced cancer, a lot of variability. Patients were mostly stage 4, some of them stage 3, and they wore the wristband for a couple of weeks, and they came out with this data. Very interesting. We can see that their activity, the steps correlated with the ECOG, the distance they walked every day, and this had a clear impact on survival, on adverse events, hospitalization, and overall survival. And we can see here patients that walk more than 2,000 steps every day. They had a very good prognosis, while patients with less than 1,000 steps had a very poor prognosis. So this was already a hint that the activity had an impact in survival. And we had a clear opportunity because that kept on growing. Everybody's using smartwatches, smartphones that can measure your activity. There are more than 224 million users worldwide. More than 12% of the population in US uses every day. In UK, here you can see the data, 12 million patients, population has it. In Spain, there was a poll, and 45% of responders say they own a smartwatch, and 68% have them for health purpose, to monitor their activity. So we wanted to go a step forward, and not only to see, okay, your activity correlates with your prognosis. We already know that and have the subjective impression of that. We want to do an objective performance status and totally get rid of this classification and use the fitness tracker to do a very proper objective classification instead of the subjectivity of the doctor in the interview. So for that, we use patients that were coming to our phase 1 clinical trials unit. We tried to correlate, that was the primary objective of our study, correlate this objective PS with the classical scales and the patient prognosis, because we wanted it to be better than ECOG, because if the ECOG works in the end, then you say, okay, why am I going to change it if that's pretty good enough? We want it to be better. So this was the way we designed the study. We had patients coming for a phase 1 trial, and once they signed the consent for a particular phase 1 study, we gave them the wristband, and they wore the wristband during the screening period. By that, we wanted to avoid the different toxicity, because when patients are with chemo, maybe they have adverse events, and that affects their situation for a couple of days, but it doesn't reflect the baseline activity. So that's why we use the screening period. And once the patient started the phase 1 trial, we ended this project. We also gave them the EORTC quality of life questionnaires to make sure that these data also correlate with the patient perspective. So this is all. We measure steps, we measure walking, the distance walked, and sleep hours. We didn't measure any heart rate or anything else because of the battery. With these 3 measurements, the battery could last for more than 20 days. So that was very useful for us. And also the usual demographics. And we also collected some lab values to correlate with the usual prognostic scores like the Royal Marsden score, LDH, and albumin. The study design, we tried to do the ROC, the receptor operating curves, to determine the cutoff point for survival in all the variables, and the usual survival analysis. And these are our results. We enrolled 111 patients, and we had full data of 70. And as we can see here, they're the usual patient population, median age around 60 years old. Most of them were male. Almost 20% were having a lung cancer, but as you can see there, they were all type of solid tumor patients, and most of them were heavily pretreated, but still candidates for phase 1 trials. And these are the results in patient characteristics. As we can see, the median days they wore the device was almost 2 weeks, and the median of daily meters was 2,400 meters per day. And regarding ECOG, by the doctor's perception, 60% were 0 and 40% were 1. We didn't have ECOG 2 or 3 because they are usually excluded from clinical trials. And these are the results of the primary analysis in terms of univariate Cox regression models. Distance was the most significant predictor. We settled the cutoff point in 1,200 meters per day, the median. Hazard ratio was 5.76, and steps was pretty similar because they are obviously directly correlated. Hours of sleep didn't have any correlation with survival, and ECOG PS it did have, but way less than distance, and the RMH score was almost in the verge of statistically significant. And when we put these results into a Kaplan-Meier plot, we see that the patients with a good OPS, more than 1,200 meters, have a median OS of 11.2 months, and poor OPS, less than 1,200, median OS of 3.2 months, very, very significant data. The concordance between the doctor's ECOG and the real objective PS, we can see that was not very good correlated. Almost 15% of patients ECOG 0 by the doctor, well, totally wrongly associated. And in terms of ECOG 1, it was like totally random. So there was not very good correlation with the result. And by multivariate analysis, we could confirm that distance was the only predictor that consistently was correlated with survival in the multivariate analysis. And also in terms of patient-reported outcomes, the EORTC quality of life questionnaires, we can see that patients that had ECOG 0 by the doctor had obviously better quality of life, but the distance between ECOG 1 and 0 was 13 points, while with our objective performance status, the distance was 24.8 months. So by this data, we were able to separate patients with better quality of life with those with worse. So these were our conclusions in our study, that OPS was an independent prognostic factor, stronger than the ECOG, that this correlates with patients' perceived quality of life, and we think it's a better assessment. And with this data, we went to the Journal of Clinical Oncology, tried to publish it, and they say no, because it was a single study institution. So we say, okay, yeah, that is true. So we wanted to validate it. We didn't submit it to other journal. We say, let's validate our data. And I had the opportunity to meet with an investigator from the University of Pennsylvania who had a very similar data, but they were looking for predictors of hospitalization. But in the end, they had the same. They had patients monitored. So this year we presented at ASCO the external validation of our data. And basically, they had patients with a bit different population, because it was not phase 1 patients. They were general oncology patients undergoing chemotherapy, mainly lung and GI cancer. And they did the same. They gave them a feedback that their patients were for 6 months, because their outcome was to predict hospitalization. But we used just the first week of data to see what was the basal activity of those patients. And the primary outcome of this analysis was 6 months survival. As you can see here, their population was 75 patients, and they were pretty similar, except for the for the tumor types that were mainly GI and lung. And this data is the results they had. I find very interesting that the mean distance that their patients walk was almost the same, 2,500 meters. So that shows how comparable were the two populations. The ECOG also pretty similar, because only 2 patients had ECOG 2 and 3. And we can see the results were very, very similar. Their hazard ratio was 5.22. Patients classified as good OPS, more than 1,200 meters, had 92% chances to be alive at 6 months, compared with 64% of those with poor OPS. And as we can see, the Kaplan-Meier plots, this was the only predictor of survival, the distance walk. This is sleep, hours of sleep, clinician ECOG, patient-reported ECOG, no clinically significant. So the distance walk was definitely a prognostic factor, and in multivariate analysis was the only significant predictor of mortality with a hazard ratio of 7. And similarly, they found very poor concordance between their assessment of ECOG and the objective PS. Similar, 85% was correct, and here also very, very similar results. So with this, we think that the OPS, the objective prognostic score, defined as walk more or less than 1,200 meters per day, is independent prognostic factor and is externally validated and accurately risk stratifies patients between low and high risk of mortality. We obviously have some limitations, because these findings may not be extrapolable to any cancer patient. some patients were excluded, and we didn't have patients with ECOG 2 or 3, but they are already predicted to have poor prognosis. And interesting, the FDA has a draft guidance on cancer clinical trial eligibility criteria when they talk about performance status, and this guide is from April this year. They say at the end of the paragraph, wearable devices can also be explored to add additional objective activity data to compare with clinician and patient report. So we can expect that at some point the FDA and probably the AMA will ask for this data to make sure that the patients were correctly identified for the trial. And we can continue with many, many examples from this year. This study came out earlier this year with very similar patients with advanced lung cancer, 111 patients. And I want to highlight again, the median distance walk was the highest predictor of overall survival and a hazard ratio very good. And when we look at the raw data in terms of the different ECOG, we see this is mean distance walk. 1,000 meters seems to be a clear cutoff between those patients with very good prognostic ECOG 0 and those with ECOG more than 0. So we are probably around, I can say it's 1,200 for sure, but at least that number may be close to the cutoff point. So what is the future? I think with machine learning device, we can even improve our data, adding more things than steps. There's this study that counted step from 2014 patients undergoing chemoradiotherapy, and they wore the device to the chemoradiotherapy. They tested 3 different machine learning models, and it's very interesting how, if we look at, for example, this model, the elastic net, that was actually the best model to predict. When they looked at only clinical variables, it was very, very bad to predict outcomes. But when they added only step counts, it was very good. So step counts were even better than clinical variables to predict the outcomes in this trial. So with this, I want to end my conclusion that wearable devices are really practical tools for integrated into oncology care, high adherency rate, and even patients already come to clinic with one smartwatch. You don't have to provide it to them. Daily distance walk is an independent prognostic factor for survival that accurately risk stratified patients between low and high risks, and we propose 1,200 meters as a cutoff for good and poor prognostic patients, and further research is needed to integrate advanced biometrics like heart rate, glucose levels with machine learning to still fine-tune the prognostic outcomes, and we can even have that on real time. And I like to end up with just a single image, because in the end, when we walk out and go back to our daily practice, this is something that after I did this research, I do every day. And when I talk to a patient, I just ask him, show me the distance, how much do you walk every day instead of how many hours do you spend on bed? It's like, show me your smartwatch. And I've done this image with Dali, and for some reason, the doctor has no legs, but I'm sorry. So I want to thank again the AppSmart project. You're all aware we want still to validate this prospectively, and we have the APACE project, and we want to integrate our objective prognostic score into this study. So in the future, maybe we will have the whole scientific community will use the same parameter to be comparable between different studies. And with that, I want to thank all my team at the START Phase 1 program, Fundación Jiménez Díaz, University of Pennsylvania, the AppSmart Network, and you for your attention. Thank you.